Hey, folks!
Holy crap!
Yes, you there, commoner. It looks like you're trying to paint some skin tones and could use some help.
Well, not really. I'm fine.
Well, you're in luck, Timmy.
Look, my name isn't Timmy, but... Hey, how did you get in?
I recently painted this crew, and one of the models showcases one of my favorite things to paint, which is roided out muscles and skin. So today, I'm going to show you how I approach painting skin tones, as well as a little bonus later on. So grab your chloroform rag and some duct tape.
Wait, what's that for?
And let's put the lotion on its skin. Before we start slapping on some paint, let's go over some basic ideas on breaking down how we'll tackle this model. One of the best practices to have when painting models is to break it down into shapes. Visualizing these general shapes will help us get a rough idea of how we may want to place some highlights and shading. With these rough shapes in mind, we're going to determine where our key light source is going to be. An approach that is typical in miniature painting is zenithal lighting, which is just fancy talk for having your key light source coming from above. With the imaginary light at the top, we're going to keep in mind that the shapes closest to the light will be brighter, and as we go further away from the light, there will be a little less light along the way. With this idea, we also want to keep in mind that each shape is going to have hot spots of light, with the most intense hot spots coming from the shapes closest to the light. Now, let's get back to the model itself. Let's identify the actual major shapes on the model by looking at each major shape that is present. These are the big blocks that will draw focus, and we're going to observe how each major shape curves, bends, and reflects light in their own unique but generalized way. Now, within these major shapes, we're going to identify the minor shapes that are contained within each region. These are the subtle peaks and valleys that give your major shapes that extra flavor. Observing these minor shapes will help inform us even more on placing shading and highlights, but remember that these ones are there to serve the major shapes and should be painted in relation to their placement on that shape and their relation to the key light. Keeping all these things in mind, we'll get an idea of light placement and hot spots all together, but remember that it's just a rough idea, and we can change them as we see fit along the way. Now that we've gotten an idea on lighting and shapes, let's move on to colors and application. The traditional approach is to pick a shade, midtone, and highlight color. Although I'm picking a golden skin color, these can be any 3 colors you'd like as the approach will be the same. Now, ever since I was a kid, I always visualized the same thing for colors, which is a bar. I'd label 1 at the top and 10 at the bottom, and I'd place white and black respectively to represent my entire range. And with those 3 colors chosen, I'd place them somewhere in the middle of that bar with an arbitrarily relative number, like 3, 4, and 5, as they're closer to white than black. Then I'd hone in on this section as my full bar to limit my range of color. Now, if I want to push the color range darker, I can add in a mix or a wash to the darkest one, and I'd call it 5.5. And if I want to push my range lighter, I'll say mix in some white to the highlight and call it 2.5. The difference between my numbers is what will create and enhance my contrast, as when I paint my 2.5 right next to my 5.5, it's a pretty big difference and should pop pretty well without going too crazy. Now, how we apply these colors will also drastically change the appearance of the shape. We can emphasize one portion of the bar when we paint it on a shape, and it can change the overall look even while using the exact same 4 colors. Keep these in mind and play around with the application, as we'll need to remember these ideas as we apply them from our highest major shapes down to our lowest major shapes. Alright Timmy, enough jibba jabba. Let's paint some skin. For our first layer, we're going to apply a base coat of Reaper's Golden Shadow. Now, remember what I always say, folks. Base coats are the foundation of your paint jobs, and clearing your browser history is the foundation of your marriage. Be sure to thin down your paints with water, and when you're painting your base coats, it's a good practice to go with the flow of your model's shapes. You'll want to paint in the direction of the ridges rather than go against them as best you can, because when you go against the grain, it will sort of scrape off your paint into the gaps, and you'll have to be quick to redistribute that paint out of there before it starts drying. In your first pass, you're going to want to focus on coverage and not opacity. It isn't important that it's completely hiding the primer. It's more important to get some paint on there to stick to later on. Now for a color like this, it may be more difficult with black primer than it is with white, but it isn't impossible. I like to think of it as an opportunity to practice your basics and get good habits forming. Looks like crap, right? Well, that's why we'll paint on multiple layers. When your first layer is dry, apply the same practices as before and you'll start to see some improved coverage. Take note of the places that are covered better than others and try to work those areas a little less. I repeat the process for a third coat, and some places are already pretty well covered, while others still need some work. Keep in mind that your paint will look different when it dries, so try not to overwork it. Now for my final coat, I'm focusing on the last few spots that the primer is still showing through, and I won't need to work on any other areas that have good coverage. Taking your time with base coats is super important. It may be a pain at times, but it really does make your subsequent work really shine better. For my purposes, I don't need it to be absolutely perfect, but you could work on it even more to get it really solid. For our next step, we're going to take some GW Flesh Wash and go to town on this bad boy with a heavy wash, and I mean heavy. Like so heavy, if it were a movie, it'd be a pretty heavy one. Like Schwarzenegger's Commando. Let off some steam, Bennett. So deep. The purpose of this step is to deepen our shadows and take our range down a half step. The recesses where the wash pools together will act as a guide, or sort of outline, of all our shapes we observed before. Try to work quickly. I like to work in segments that make sense to me going from the top down. It doesn't take too long before parts of the wash start drying, and you'll want to avoid touching or manipulating it at that point. Brushing too fast, though, can create bubbles that you'll want to pop immediately if possible. Go ahead and cover all the parts you painted. It'll be our little secret. I've noticed that sometimes this will end up glossy. Don't worry though, you can always apply some watered down matte varnish when you're done painting the model entirely. Alright, for our first painted layer, we're going to take that same shade of golden shadow and reapply it onto the model. With this step, we're going to focus on covering about 90% of our shapes, leaving an outline of washed color in the recesses of the shape and in the darker areas toward the bottom of the major shapes. Because we did such a fine job on our base coats, this shouldn't be too difficult, and I leave some additional outlines for a select few minor shapes. Don't worry about leaving an outline for absolutely every minor shape. In fact, it'll work better if you combine some shapes at this step, especially toward the top of your model for some of the major and minor shapes. You may be thinking, well, why did we cover the entire thing with wash when we're going to go right back over it with the same color? First off, I don't need lip from you, Timmy. Secondly, I feel that the overall wash really helps with identifying your shapes, and as you get more advanced, maybe you can just do a targeted wash, as you'll be able to better identify everything. But lastly, I've done both ways, and I feel the model gets an entirely different look when done otherwise. But hey, it's your model. Try it out and see for yourself on what works best for you. You may notice that, although there are ridges and other values present in some major shapes, I'll just color in the whole block solid. That's because I plan on highlighting those ridges in later steps. Remember that how we apply the colors can change the entire look of each shape, and if you want a more subtle change in your elevation, you can do so when you get higher on the color bar. Earlier I pointed out that the further away you get from the key light above, you'll have a darker effect. At this stage, we're near the bottom of our color bar, so it's okay to paint everything here since we're near the darkest color of our range. Plus, for my style, I kind of like having a more uniform and bold look, but you'll see that as I get to the bottom of the back, I leave more of the wash showing. For our next layer, we're going up to Reaper's Golden Skin, which I totally remembered to record the right bottle for. Here we're going to cover about 80 to 90% of the previous layer's shape, leaving room at the bottom of each shape and in the darker recesses. Toward the top of the major shapes with flat areas, I'll push the perimeter very close and sometimes entirely. For some areas like the deltoid and chest, I'll start to define the ridges a bit more by leaving outlines of the golden shadows showing, but I'll still combine some minor shapes that I want to have an even more subtle elevation to. At this stage, I'll also start to introduce some texture by roughly hatching in my brush strokes to create an irregular pattern. For muscles like these, it adds a cool effect and gives the impression of sinew and other stuff that's present in burly boys such as myself. But for the big, flat, smooth areas, I still keep it to a pretty clean line. Spots like the bicep, forearm, abs, and back are good examples of these. Varying up your textures like this is a tremendous benefit, because when you have everything looking the exact same, it gives an odd look. You don't want to do that, because giving the wrong looks is off-putting to folks and may give away the fact that you're dead inside. Try to have a bit more coverage than you think you'll need, as we'll need some room for later steps. And don't worry about it looking patchy or cel-shaded. Layering like this will have that effect as you make bigger jumps up the color bar like we're doing here. The goal is to define the area's mid-tone, and this tone is going to be the majority of the overall color anyway. Just go with your gut and ignore your doubts and the haters. Depending on how your paint is behaving, you may need to go over it with an additional layer to get it opaque. This is the step that's probably going to have the biggest jump in color. In the previous steps, we ended up with two colors that are very close to each other, being that the wash is just a filtered color over our base coat. So when we layered at that stage, it felt really close. But with this color, especially when placed right next to the washed areas, you'll really start to see the contrast, which is a good thing. Contrast like this is what makes a model pop on the table, so just trust in the process. But after a few tries, if you still feel like you want to adjust it, then just play around with your application to land on what feels right. Now we're ready for the next step, where we apply a glaze.
Okay, man, like I said before, I don't really need any help, and I'm starting to feel a little uncomfortable, so I'd really like for you to lead. I said, glaze.
Here we're going to take our shade color and do our best to blend in those hard edges from the mid-tone. On our color bar, this is where we'd go from 4 and 5 and add in the color of 4.5. What you'll need to do is make your paint transparent by mixing in some Glaze medium or GW's Lamian medium, which is my favorite, but you can also do this by just adding in more water to get a wash-like consistency. After loading up your brush with the mix, wipe it off onto a paper towel a little bit before applying it onto the perimeters of where the mid-tone meets up with the shadow color. Glazing can be very subtle. The trick to it is that you'll want to apply it and then let it dry before adding on any more. Glazes will look very different after it cures, and the power of glazes really opens up with multiple layers right on top of each other. Try to focus on areas where the transition from dark to light occur. It can be a good tip to move your brush strokes from the base coat up toward the mid-tone. Another note about glazing is that it tends to be easier and a little bit better looking when glazing a darker color over a lighter color, but there isn't a rule about doing both. Just remember to let it fully dry before adding more. Feel free to experiment. I was surprised to find out that when I applied different colors from different ranges, it felt like a whole new effect came out that I didn't expect. If you're not liking the harsh outlines from the wash layer, you can try glazing this color over it to soften the transition a bit. I particularly like it because, well, it gives a cool effect like a comic book. And when I notice areas that may be too crazy, I just push the perimeter of my first layer further or just cover it entirely, so I don't feel the need to glaze over it very much. This is also another stage that you can start to add in some super cool textures into areas that may seem a bit flat. You can do some hatch lines in areas like the back or biceps that, like in our previous step, will add some subtle hints of muscle underneath. Because our glaze is very transparent, it can be a great way of adding texture without committing to really harsh lines. And like I said before, varying up your textures avoids having a samey look everywhere, which can be really off-putting. In the next step, we're going to be placing our final layer by adding highlights using Reaper's golden highlight color. For this step, I like to apply it to about maybe 10 to 20% of the previous layer depending on the shape. This is also the step where I start to diverge from the previous layer a bit and focus on hot spots and ridges rather than the entirety of the major or minor shape. This is probably the step where our talk about key lighting really comes into focus. So far, everywhere has been applied pretty uniform, with only slight changes in the lighting from the top of the model to the bottom. But with my highlight color, I really start to focus on those hot spots we identified right at the beginning. Areas like the shoulders, the top of the neck area, and the top of the biceps and forearms will get higher intensity in application of this color. And when I get down to, say, the hand, I'm starting to limit the application even further. This is also an opportunity to add a bit of accenting to locations that could benefit from standing out more, like the knuckles and fingers that could really pop from the fact that there's more of a darker application already placed there. And I'm also keeping in mind those final places that want subtle texture by adding in some strong hatch lines. Placing these highlights relatively close to where the wash color is visible is also a great technique to make your model pop. The contrast of placing your 5.5 color next to your 3 color can really be... Hey, what's going on over there? One second, folks. Where are you going? Where do you think you're going? We have so much to learn! Please, don't do this. I have kids. Well, they're cats. Wait, is that a taser? Give me 1 second. There we go. There, isn't that better? Sorry for the rude interruption, folks. Anyways, for our last step, we're going to do a final glaze using our mid-tone to blend in the perimeter of our last layer to the previous one. We'll basically use the same technique we did before, slowly placing the glaze onto the areas where the transition occurs, allowing it to dry, and placing more layers of glaze when needed. When you go further down the model, you can also cover the entirety of the highlight layer with this glaze, just to get a subtle variation of lighting. Don't worry, it'll still appear as a highlight, but it'll differentiate just a bit more compared to the top of the model. Another tip to keep in mind about glazing is in regard to your brush stroke. With a runnier paint like this, you may notice that the place where your brush leaves the model at the end of your stroke will gather more paint than where you started. Keep this in mind and get a feel for how to manipulate this brush stroke to your benefit. If it's too much, maybe you'll need to wipe the brush more onto your paper towel, or change up the direction of your brush stroke for the area. Getting used to new techniques takes practice, and it's very likely the first time you try the application, it won't line up with what you've seen or how you imagined it. Don't give up! Adjust the application or try new things to figure out what works best for you.
Are we done yet? Will you let me go? Nope. Bonus round!
Since this fella has so much real estate when it comes to his skin, I figured I'd spice things up by adding in a tattoo. I get them just to feel something again. I practiced a few designs on paper and landed on a swirly design to go with the flow of the model and grabbed some coffee for courage. Now get yourself a dark green color and some black because we're gonna make a mother mix using these two colors, but you can also try other colors for different effects like blue or red. After mixing these two on the palette, we'll make 3 different piles, then we'll take our 3 skin tone colors and mix this mother into each one. I'll first start by faintly and carefully drawing in lines for my design using the darkest color mix. Once I'm happy with its placement, I'll begin to strengthen the line weight by thickening up the line. I start with where the line is actually placed, but depending on how the shaping is going, I'll start to go on either side of the line until I get the thickness and opacity I'm looking for. Try your best to get a uniform, solid line along the entirety of your design, and be sure to take your sweet time doing so. You really don't want to mess up all that hard work you did on the skin. Keeping your paint thin is really important, but also keeping your brush point sharp and fresh is super critical to make this easier. I tended to rinse my brush very often throughout the process, almost nearly every time I applied some paint. And I used a wet palette to ensure my paint doesn't thicken up over a long period of time. To keep everything uniform, you don't want to have to remix another batch of paint halfway through your session. For minor mistakes or reshaping your line, you can take your skin tone colors used before and cover up the areas you want changed or fixed. See, isn't learning new things fun? Wait, certainly you're not uncomfortable anymore, are you? Tell you what, champ, if you're uncomfortable, blink twice. Go ahead, it's okay. See folks, he's having a grand time. For the next step, we're going to take our mid-tone mix and carefully fill in the thick lines that we've laid down so far, starting in the middle of each line. I try to go right up to the edge of the thick line so that it leaves the faint impression of an outline with the dark green. This is a much easier trick than starting with the mid-tone and trying to add outlines with the dark color to everything. When I'm doing this, I try to cover nearly every part of the tattoo, maybe only leaving in the dark color for the really recessed areas, but most of the time I just cover it all up. If you've successfully done the first step, then this should be no more difficult than that one, because all we're doing is the same thing, but with a different color and a slightly smaller thickness. So all the previous tech should work here, like making sure you have a clean sharp point by rinsing your brush often, and keeping that mix lubricated by using a wet palette. And now to finish it off, we're going to take our highlight mix and fill in the line in the same manner. The only difference now is that we're going to focus on the raised portion of the tattoo on the model. For flat areas, we're going to color in the entirety of the previous color, but for ridged areas like the shoulder, we're going to leave the mid-tone color showing in the recesses to add some dimension to our tattoo without losing the overall effect of a solid tattoo. Now, although I'm doing a simple swirl design, you can use this same technique for any design you feel like doing. Let's say you wanted a double-headed eagle for some reason. You can color in the shape of a silhouette entirely with your dark mix, then start adding in the separated shapes within the silhouette using your mid-tone mix, leaving lines of the dark color as an outline, and finally highlighting those shapes within your mid-tone with your lightest mix. Maybe one day I can show you how to do a whole sleeve design with this tech. But for now, we're going to call this model done with the sexiest of solid black rings for the base. There you have it, folks! If you liked the video and you want to buy some Malifaux stuff, support my channel by using the link in the description below. Now, Timmy wants to learn how to dry brush, so we're going to hang out a little bit more. It's cute when he struggles.